Professor Nitasha Kaul. We're really honored to have her here lecturing, particularly on the topic of Bhutan and subaltern geopolitics in relation to Bhutan. Tibetans in general have a great interest in Bhutan, but we don't talk about it enough. We don't know enough about the issue or the country, and I think it's particularly right now, given the rivalry or conflict between India and China, and in the kind of world order that we are entering, it seems that the importance of Bhutan as a political issue is set to grow. So we are really honored to have you speak to us about Bhutan. And let me now just go through official reading of the bio. I'll be very quick. Nitasha Kaul is a multidisciplinary academic, novelist, poet, artist, and economist. Currently an associate professor in politics and international relations at the Center for the Study of Democracy, University of Westminster in London. She has previously worked as an assistant professor in economics and as an associate professor in creative writing. Over the last 2 decades, she has researched and published extensively on themes relating to democracy, political economy, identity, rise of right-wing nationalism, feminist and post-colonial critiques, and of course, Bhutan, India, and Kashmir. So we are really honored to have you here with us. Please give me a hand in welcoming.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Tendor. Thank you, Jamyang, for hosting me and hosting us. It is truly a pleasure, and to everyone online as well, who either now or in the future may be able to share our words. Okay, I recently started wearing spectacles, so if I keep trying to put them on and off, that's not because I'm posing, it's simply because I'm still not adjusted to whether I can see properly with or without them. So you will bear with me for those quirks. So I am going to be talking about Bhutan, and and because there is only so much one can talk about in the space of a lecture, short lecture. If you are interested in knowing further about any of these things that I might mention today and aren't able to be covered in the Q&A, there's all of my work is open access and freely available. And there's some recent works that will speak to these concerns. For instance, some of the articles that I've recently published in peer-reviewed academic journals. One relates to the ways in which small states figure in international relations, and how do we understand their foreign policy trajectory. So that's one article on Bhutan. It's in the International Relations of the Asia Pacific Journal. And then there's other work that I've done in the Journal of Asian Studies or the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, which kind of looks back at the ways in which, for instance, the in-betweenness framing of Himalayan polities works. So the fact that they are seen exhaustively as in between India and China, and what that does, and how that in-betweenness actually has shifted over time. So once upon a time, it would not have been seen as in between a democratic India and a communist China. It would have been seen as in between British India and the riches of Tibet. So, the ways in which that in-betweenness construction works has a geopolitical imaginary. So there's that work. And also something that I will really more be focusing about today, which is to look at how knowledge construction about, and in this case, the Himalayas, and more specifically Bhutan, how do we know what we know about, a country like Bhutan? And to an extent, how this connects with what we have been talking about is because it is an endeavor of decolonizing the imagination, right? So how do we get at, the link between history and whose accounts of that history is seen as authoritative? So whose accounts get reproduced forward in time and are seen as the important ones, and how does that shape our understanding of specific countries? How do stories about those countries travel? And why this is important is because stories, of course, including stories about nations, aren't just stories. As I say in the very first sentence of this piece that I will be speaking to you about, stories are a bigger part of history, and much history begins from hearsay. So the political relationalities between entities that we take as that are present in our world today actually go back to how certain kinds of knowledge were created, and this knowledge making, especially about non-Western world, especially about the Himalayas, happened within a matrix of the imperial era, and it was shaped fundamentally by that. And in this, today, I'll really just be doing one small part of that with talking about how we come to understand what we know about Bhutan. Okay, so it's also a critique about the Orientalism of historiography in relation to this Himalayan region. All right. So, so that's sort of like the backstory. And one of the reasons this is important is because you would think that from the imperial era, when we go to the post-colonial era, a lot would change, but actually not that much changes in terms of how the othering process works. Actually, a lot of it's not officially imperial or even officially colonized, but the imperious way in which that othering happens to the Himalayan peoples continues into the 20th century, even after formal decolonization happens in the Indian subcontinent. So, so my concern really is here to talk about the historical knowledge production about Bhutan. The first thing to say about that is that it has happened through two main means why people wanted to know about it: travel and strategy. And these two kinds of stories, the stories that come from people who are, telling their accounts of travel and the strategy accounts, they're both interlinked, because travel fuels the fire for commercial exploration that then leads to the need for strategic knowledge. And so therefore these two kinds of stories are connected. And when we find these stories in the, when they carry forward in time, they are these accounts, and typically they are accounts of a certain kind of, a male knowledge-making figure, are seen as authoritative and reproduced without any critical questioning of, why these people are being understood in this way. So in essence, it's about the representational dynamics that construct these geographies of power, which I will shortly kind of, unpack. Now, what is the standard account? So the standard account of what historians know about Bhutan is that, there was in 16, there's maybe I should, okay. So what people often don't note is that there are hearsay accounts that actually refer to this country before people have even gone there. It's just hearsay. There is this country and this is what those people are in that country. And then you have the missionaries, the accounts of the Portuguese Jesuit missionaries who go there, searching for the kingdom of Cathay in history, but end up in all sorts of places, and Bhutan was one of them. This is in the 17th century. Then you have a range of British missions, and over time, 1774, 75, 77, 1783, 1837, 38, 1864, 1905, 1907. So a continuous kind of engagement, and yet everyone says this is a remote place. This construction, this idea that Himalayan places were always remote is a certain story. It fits a certain end, but it's not empirically the truth. And also something people often don't realize is that the role of the of what you would refer to as natives was also significant. So Bose and Roy in 1815 led one of the British missions. And who is this Roy? It's Raja Ram Mohan Roy. So many people actually don't know that, you have, so the figures that are relevant in, say, if you talk about Bengal Renaissance in the 19th century, everyone knows about Raja Ram Mohan Roy from that historical context. But very few people know that Raja Ram Mohan Roy was also part of this mission that's going on this, on this report. And one of the things that I argue in my work is that these knowledges, when produced by, the kind of Europeans, is taken very differently from when it is produced by others. Including the Himalayan peoples themselves. So, they're seen as, Asiatics are seen as capable of producing less valid knowledge as opposed to the knowledge produced by the Europeans. Okay, then And I think I will, in the interests of time, just go straight to the three main things that I want to focus on. So I'm arguing, and I would like you to think, one, this is all not just accidental. There is a systematicity with which knowledge is made about Himalayan peoples, in this case, Bhutan. It is systematic. Second, there is a selectivity with which specific texts are travel forward in time and are reproduced all the time, whereas other stories get forgotten. So there is a selectivity about what we know. And thirdly, there is the salience of positionality. Who is making the knowledge matters. So if you have an illiterate explorer at one point, for example, one person who worked in the Himalayas as part of this great trigonometrical survey, his account was not even taken as authoritative until it was validated by Europeans. So it mattered who was doing the knowledge making, and that was tied into what their position was in terms of their own identity. So in what follows, I will talk about these three specific things. First, the systematicity. So there is a systematic account of what we know about Bhutan. As I said, the Kachela Cabral visit, the Jesuit missionaries, Bogle, the British missions, then you get to the political officers, and that's pretty much it. And then, and that's how kind of the story is told. This is a systematic set of representations that project the country as, and the Tibetans have also faced a lot of this, as timeless, strange, backward, innocent, wicked, depending on what the objectives were at a certain point in time. This knowledge that is produced is done with asymmetric power, paternalism, commercial or security considerations, how they get to be seen. So the very first account is this person called Ralph Fitch, who was a pioneer Englishman in 1583, who gives this hearsay account of Bhutan. He hasn't been there, but his account gets reproduced in 1595 book by another person called Hakluyt. And this is a book about voyages. And in this, they say, well, these are very strange people. They have ears as long as they have very long ears. They are sort of look like apes. They have very good horses. The people are very swift on foot, and all sorts of Orientalist generalizations. Now, so you might think this is just a story, but it isn't really, because Hakluyt's account of these voyages, imagined account of who the Bhutanese were, was published in 1599. The East India Company was formed in 1600. And he was an advisor to the East India Company. And Fitch was became a consultant to the East India Company. So this desire to know about the faraway others was tied very much to also a strategic commercial, came to be tied to that story of the making of the modern world through the commercial and explorations and the political relationalities that they created that came out of it. So the sailors, merchants, explorers, missionaries who were in search of God, gold, or glory inevitably managed to find human beings that weren't quite human in the same way. They somehow lacked in some, either physically they lacked or morally they lacked. And this is the same, by the way, with Tibetan accounts of the period, on which there's, of course, work. So Fitch's account is then reproduced in 1899 by a scholar called Riley, who footnotes Fitch's account and says, this is all right, but what a tragedy that that Lhasa was not penetrated. So it's seen as this pathway on way to Lhasa, and he says that these people are they have misgovernment, their morals are low, they have polyandry, there's all of this, there's a lot wrong, and the monastic institutions, which of course were always seen as the root cause of a lot of evil, so that their monastic institutions are problematic. Now this. And this idea that, and later Curzon, Lord Curzon writes about this, that, this is just merchant adventurers. All of this happened by chance. And I'm saying it wasn't chance. There is a way in which there is a systematic way in which knowledge and power are interlinked in the, in the way in which imperial expansion happens and then gets naturalized. And this was also, by the way, the epistemological, which is to say the knowledge part of this power exercise is equally important, if not more, because through this period in the Himalayas, there is a systematic over time disentangling and classification of people, of objects, of land, of customs, a reordering of the world of the Himalayas, as if there was no other ordering that existed before. There were no indigenous systems of reckoning. It's like a whole new creation of who these people are, and they are written into history by the Europeans, but that is also the history they get written into, so much so that what preceded it becomes irrelevant and impossible to discern anymore. And this continues well into the 20th century. So in the 1960s, you have, Ward, a map maker, and I think also a consultant surgeon who visits Bhutan. And so this reproduction of the same story goes on. These are, obscure people. We don't know where they originate from. They've always been remote, etc. And so you would think it would stop there, but of course it doesn't. So in the 60s also, the MEA officer, who was then a political officer to Sikkim and Bhutan in the 60s, Coelho, also reproduces Fitch's account. So it's like that continues to travel beyond the imperial era to say that, these are a virile people, their origins are lost in obscurity, they have no reform, there's kind of nothing happening. It is an Indian guru who's brought them Buddhism. And you can see that that's a very particular telling also that tries to minimize the link with Tibetan, anything Tibetan, and to portray, in fact, a very Hindu civilizational origin of the Himalayan peoples, which is, of course, again, problematic. And also, not to say that there wasn't anything going on, there wasn't any ferment in Bhutan, which is particularly not true, given if you think about the incidents in the 1960s, where there were, major political instances, which were the outcome, apparently, of the struggles between the modernizers and the traditionalists. So this idea that it's a static place with no history, which has always been remote, is obviously not true. But historians focus on selective years that they actually tell these stories. So British historians will stop at a certain year, Indians will start and stop at a certain year. And this is, again, very peculiar, because historians, why stop at specific years? But you find that it happens. And again, there's a lot more there that I can't go into here. Also, the people get classified, they go up and down a racial hierarchy depending on what purposes are of interest at any point. So for instance, when trade needs to be opened up, the people are sturdy, simple, they have a good sense of humor. But at times when there are commercial kind of or cultivation, land, kind of territorial disputes or things like that, the people all then become very greedy, and the music is horrible, and even the mules are horrible. So everything about there is therefore a link between the foreign policy and the way in which the representation works. And later figures, such as, for instance, John Claude White and others, are aware of the ways in which previous people, such as Pemberton in 1837 or Eden in 1864, whose mission actually led to a war between Britain and Bhutan, they are aware that these accounts were problematic. Yet in every instance, the idea is they were problematic, they were wrong, but maybe not completely unreasonable. And how they'll say that? They'll say, well, there was this one good person. So this, what I call the turkey pardon scenario, everyone may be bad, but there's like the one or two good people that make it, somehow make a difference. And again, many instances of that. There is a link, I think, also between the empire and the epidermis in how the Himalayas get racialized, so that Vogel sees the people there having complexions as fair as the French. Turner says that they have a martial weakness, which is not because they lack courage, but because they want discipline. Griffiths actually says that they are completely immoral, and although the lower orders are cheerful, all of the higher orders don't have any good quality except the one porter that he met. So there's specific ways in which and even later writers on this look at all of this and say it's unfair but not unreasonable, and that's a very systematic trope. And these things, by the way, again, White also talks about the Jewish features, the fact that they have certain kinds of features. The Pahadiyas are industrious, but they are quarrelsome. The people of the Himalayas are classified into stocks, and that racialization continues well into the later period, and perhaps including even the present. There are also systematic attempts to present at different times people as being more or less like the Europeans. And this is something that in post-colonial period is also taken up by the Indians. So in the 1950s, so based upon archival work, the way in which the political officer in the region sees the Bhutanese is very similar to how they are seen at the start of the British relationship with them begins. That now that we want this relationship, they're actually good people at that point. So it's all very tied up into the power and knowledge are basically very tied up. And at that point, in fact, it is said that they are, just to be absolutely precise, yes, from 1950. At that point, they are compared unfavorably with the Tibetans, that they are hardy, Bhutanese are hardy, cheerful, hardy, hardworking and cheerful, and they are free of the extreme money conscious of the Tibetans. So depending on what is the objective at hand, the different Himalayan peoples get ranked differently in who has to be spotlighted against whom. And in this case, it was at that point in 1950, this is how they were, at least on this account, they were seen. And again, there is a very imperial echo in how the post-colonial Indians portray themselves similarly as if they were the imperial officials, in that they furnish the representations where they blend cultural curiosity with an emphasis on the remoteness and isolation, keeping in with an imperial tradition to add to the peat and charm of their own visit. I found one of the essays of a cameraman who had gone there in 1952 at the coronation of the third king. And so he writes this account, and that this place is barred to all foreigners. He, in fact, in his essay says it was a place on the patch on the map of India. This is a time when all sorts of things are happening, and he's denied permission, of course, to publish his essay. But these representations continue not just in the academic texts, but also have a link to how the othering functions in children's accounts, children's. So the Children's Book Trust of India had a book in 1967, which was republished in 2005, which shows our neighbors for the children. And the place of Tibet, so it marks Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. But there's a white place, just like the Indian Ocean, indicating an unmarked silence on the map where Tibet is supposed to be. And it simply says the Kingdom of Bhutan is bordered on the north, and I'm guessing this is because they refer to Sikkim, this must be the 2005 edition, is bordered on the north by the province of Tibet in China and by the Indian states of Sikkim in the west, West Bengal and Assam in the south, and Arunachal Pradesh in the east. So these narratives and constructions are actually not just representations of a factual reality, but constructions of that. And power and knowledge are always intertwined in the various storytelling, in the storytelling that we find. With the selectivity section, I don't need to say much, but I do need to tell you that Michael Ayres, who is well known as a scholar of the region, in his translation of the letters of the account of the Portuguese missionaries, omits, for instance, this one particular paragraph, and I go into detail, in my work talking about what that paragraph tells us and how we take certain accounts as authoritative pictures of what was actually the case. But no account is a picture. If the missionaries wrote that, it's not as if it's a direct one-on-one translation of what the reality is. That is, otherwise we would be asking questions like, why are there literally thousands of people? Why does with all sorts of exaggerations basically that they make. And lastly, the third point that so here what I'm I guess arguing and getting you to hopefully getting people to be able to see is that knowledge making does not reflect but construct what the object of study is, and in the case of the othering of the Himalayan peoples, in this case Bhutan, that's very apparent. The third point relates to positionality, and the positionality here is that is that thing that I referred to earlier, which is that while we know a lot about the geographical surveying of the Himalayas that began in the 1700s and continued way up until the end of the 19th century, the role in all of this by the people who were the native explorers, the imperial kind of people who were working but who were not the Europeans, itself presents a very interesting dilemma. First of all, there's not these people are important sources of information. They are often referred to in the names by their code name, like by their initials. Rinzin Namgyal was one, for example, and in our understanding, in what we got to know about the Himalayas and how we got to know of it, these people played an important role, and yet they're often completely written out of these histories. I refer to some texts, in particular one book from 1973 by a retired Indian surveyor and others. So these explorers, native explorers, were called Pandits. You might have come across this designation. So these were secret agents or native explorers whose job it was to go into these terrains where you couldn't sometimes send the British citizens or Europeans. The reason being, because again, going back to the point that the political relationalities I fundamentally argue that the Great Game was a kind of proto-Cold War. And in that period, the difficulty with the reason why so many strategic ambiguities were left at play helped a purpose. So for instance, at that point, Bhutan was seen as like this inner buffer to the outer buffer of Tibet. And it was easier simply to let things be without having to kind of, firmly take a stance. And in this case, the reason for using the Asiatics in inverted commas is because the political relations, the context of the political relations, foreigners would create problems if confrontations arose in areas where hostile activities against, for instance, British citizens could neither be defended nor avenged. So because you don't know where you stand. So therefore, there's this really interesting debate that at times happens about what happens. I'm using roughly the word brown people. What happens if you send brown people instead of white people? And then they're like, on the one hand, scientific exploration is useful. Also an advantage, they're much cheaper. But on the other hand, surely you couldn't get the kind of knowledge that you can get from a white explorer if an Asiatic does it. Because although they can note things, they can't really give a journal account of the situation. And in fact, their condition was often they paid a very human cost for the empire. They would come back with their limbs damaged, and they would be paid like rupees 16 or 20 a month and retire at the end of their careers and maybe get a watch or something. Very often their work, unless it was corroborated by Europeans, wasn't even seen as being valid in the same way. But another interesting thing, and this you might or might not know from other work, is that Buddhist sacred objects played a key role in this. So for instance, the use of the prayer wheel was one way of gathering information. So prayer wheel, rosary beads. So the rosary bead would be made with 100 instead of 108 beads as a way of counting steps, or a prayer wheel in which you could keep a compass, you could keep notes. And then of course, if you saw a very devout person who was posing as a Buddhist pilgrim and twirling his prayer wheel, you would be less likely to disturb him or to engage in conversation with him. So this is not, of course, it's not new, but in the context of the Himalayas, this kind of work exists in scattered different sources, and bringing this together in the context, certainly there's no conversation about this in the context of Bhutan. So these Asiatics versus the European travelers again play a key role in how knowledge gets constructed. And then along the line that Tibet always was this kind of bigger goal, and many of the not just the missions, but many of the accounts are quite explicit about this. I suppose since I've already been, it's probably already 4 out of the 5 minutes I've used, if not more, I think I will just conclude. So what I want to say really is that the representations and reconstructions of these encounters with the Himalayan people are asymmetric in terms of who had the power to have their views be heard and reproduced. There's the various texts on Bhutan and the Bhutanese that I'm referring to here. There are different, of course, competing interpretations and motives. There are, it's not like one story of a certain kind of people. It's not a black and white story, right? But there is definitely an imperial matrix, including in contexts where formal colonization doesn't happen. There's an imperial matrix within which knowledge construction happens, and this is the way in which many small countries of non-Western provenance are understood in this way, and in this case, historical recounting as well as historical recording done by scholars has often reflected the positionality of the scholars, whether they're British scholars or European scholars or Indian scholars, and they tend to spotlight specific instances, specific examples of paternalism or benevolence, and neglect others. So there is therefore a lack of synthetic knowledge about those smaller regions of the world, which although not colonized, have been subject to multiple and overlapping imperial forces. And really what I'm saying is that ostensibly authoritative accounts that that are like, this is the final word on this country or its history or its people, are actually also riven with subjective interpretations, with how those texts travel forward in time, who quotes whom and why, and therefore the relationship of at least outsider knowledge production on Bhutan has been, I've argued here, affected by this systematicity, the selectivity, and the positionality of those who have created that knowledge. And the wider point really is that geopolitics and history are not neutral stories, and that the decolonizing of the imagination about how we see these people, who they are, and whose stories about them count is important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So now I want to open up for questions. Different situation where multipolarity, I'm not sure going to help.
Thank you. So, right now, I also realized, and I hope somebody will ask me, that I forgot to define subaltern geopolitics for you, but I kind of, the idea in what I'm seeking to do, not just in this particular thing that I've talked to you about today, but more broadly, is to try and look at the broad brush narratives of geopolitics rather than the big states downwards, the small state upwards. So it is essentially approaching the material with a different position, starting point, that you're not looking at. For example, if I'm looking at Bhutan, I'm not, to what extent is Bhutan's boundary discussion with China a threat for India? That's not the question. That's not the approach, my entry into. That's not the door through which I enter into Bhutan's foreign policy. Likewise, what does this Bhutan's stance on Tibet or Taiwan, what does that mean for China, or what does that mean for India? Because it's not as if those questions do not figure in a different way in what I'm seeking to do. It's just that I want to look at this from sort of like the small state upwards. What are the ways in which we can understand what we know about the small state? How does it matter in terms of being able to see what endogenously drives? So I'm less interested in serving the bigger policy agendas of any state or any dominant historical narrative. So that's what I was trying to do. And all too often, and this is a tragedy, especially for the Himalayan peoples, is that all too often they've and especially in a whole lot of other work on Kashmir, this is obviously a lot more central, that the way in which these zones of contact have been transformed into zones of conflict with contested borders, with rivalrous relationships that have ruined people's, made so many things more difficult for people, including familial kinship relationships or trade or whatever. So and as we approach a world where trans-border challenges predominate, not the least on ecological issues, it must be possible to look at these entities not just in rival terms as a zero-sum game of alliance or whatever, but in ways that facilitate something more than just buffers or transit places or so that's sort of like the motivation for a subalternizing of geopolitics, which in the particular way in which I use that. Now, your question about GNH. So GNH, okay. Most work on Bhutan is either on its ancient kind of Buddhist history or on anthropological rituals. That's one category. The other category of work is GNH or Southern Problem. So again, in tracing my pathway through this material over the last 15 or so years, I tried to avoid those key catchword phrases. So GNH is not something that I explicitly work about. However, my coming to Bhutan physically and also my work on Bhutan goes to 2006. And prior to that, in my first career as a heterodox economist, my PhD was in economics and philosophy, and my first book was called Imagining Economics Otherwise. I was already really, that main question that animated my critique of modern economics and its logic was to ask the question of how do we link the question of value and values? In other words, how are domains of culture and economy interlinked? And in what ways is that made invisible in the methods whereby the human aspect of our existence is erased so that people and things are seen as the same in an economic calculus? And to me, it is very powerful to have a way of, something that kind of throws a spanner into that ideology, to say actually people are not things. Subjective welfare matters. It doesn't matter how great the GDP is, how great the growth is. If all you see is pollution and all you see is a complete decline of any value domain, then that's not really serving a purpose. That's not an end in itself. So I already had a very strong kind of echo of this before I even knew about GNH. So hence to me, and GNH is, by the way, not the only paradigm that raises this question, right? Capabilities approaching economics does that. It's not just what you have, it's what that makes you capable of. You might have a lot of money, but if you live in a society where there's crime everywhere, what capability does that money allow you to have as a human functioning? So the question of human flourishing and moving beyond simply a material idea of welfare, materialist idea of welfare as growth or GDP or whatever, is important. And I think GNH fits into that space, in the wider world. Now, if you ask me, is it possible that GNH is actually really cynical and it's meaningless? I'm sure you'll find somebody who agrees with that. I, on my part, would take a more middle position and say that on the one hand, there is a country that has, it is a functioning Asian welfare state. It does mandate that 60% of the country remain under forest cover. So those things actually do produce certain dilemmas internally also within people, within society, between people who would prefer more focus on economy or more focus on ecology. And that you see in the debate within Bhutan too, that people who think about the different relative worth of GNH. But at the same time, I think as a, is it just a soft power thing? Maybe. But even if it is just that, what I'd like to point out is, one, there has been a lot of work about the rigorous methodologies through which we might get at GNH, right? So there's that. And also that sometimes the results that are thrown up by this work on GNH isn't what you would expect it to be. So for instance, some of the work on GNH revealed, one of the surveys revealed that people actually in the villages do not trust their neighbors very much. So you don't always end up, the methodologies for GNH don't always throw up the results that you would think that they would. It's not as if sometimes people do actually place values on material welfare, and that comes through on the GNH surveys too. So I think the methodology is rigorous, does sometimes lead to counterintuitive results. And with all its faults, I think what it does allow is that possibility of asking that question of what does it mean to look beyond just growth in this very narrow sense, and that is important. The other way in which I think this is salient is that small states, when they are Western, are seen as norm entrepreneurs. They are people who have values like Switzerland or whatever. But small states in the non-West, as opposed to the West, are seen as they are only focused on their regime survival. And I see that Bhutan kind of defies this typology. It's non-Western, but it's actually this norm entrepreneurship around GNH and happiness, which it has pursued with different degrees of emphasis in the post-democratization. It pursued a lot of that in the first government, for example. And then, not so much in the second term. So I think there's a lot of nuance and variation both within Bhutan and in Bhutanese policy in the ways in which GNH is practically translated into how much focus on it and so on. But that it offers at least a valuable tool and a comeback to be able to question projects and instances that may otherwise pass unquestioned, right? So it does allow that possibility to say, well, but how is this a GNH thing? And that happens in the media too. So I feel like it has its uses. Now, the fact that it's seen as this exotic thing for the rest of the world, sure. I mean, it's the way in which India is the land of spirituality and yoga and vegetarianism and all good things. That doesn't necessarily mean that's all it is. That doesn't mean everyone in India agrees on that. But that's the gaze through which others are interpreted. I mean, it's also not just a Western thing, by the way. It's like people in Asia, for many, not even only in history, perhaps even, this idea that, England is paved with, the pavements of London are paved with gold. That's not true. I mean, there are homeless people who are in Western countries who really suffer, and human rights denial in the West too. So it's this kind of the clear boundaries between this and that side of the West and the non-West, and who has welfare and who has human rights and who is the gazer and who's the object. I'd say that the reality of the world is a lot more complicated, and pointing that out is important. There's something else I want to say about, the thing that you previously asked. I don't know if you give me 2 more minutes, maybe I can try saying it. Yeah. Okay. So about the sovereignty thing, I do, because it's not what I was talking about today here. But sovereignty, as Stephen Krasner, one politics IR person, said, is organized hypocrisy. So, sovereignty essentially is organized hypocrisy. Different countries and different nations either have or don't have access to sovereignty. And we are such a long way from these kinds of recognitions, because states will do anything before they accept the fact that people should not be given a choice between political and economic rights, because that's fundamentally a colonial choice. And yet that is all too often still happening, with even with rising power countries, even with India, China, and it's and therefore the way in which even the mid 20th century. So in my work on like conflict, and something I've been recently thinking and reading a lot about territorial conflict, if we look at the ways in which mid 20th century decolonization debates happen, even at that time, even with kind of very explicit all of that build up, all of those, even at that time, not everyone is convinced even that the norm of decolonization ought to be happening in the first place. And you have so many people saying, oh, well, these non-Western countries, they've taken over the UN, and they keep having these declarations and make these statements. What does it mean? Why should we? This is just a way of getting back and revenge of the West kind of a discourse. So then if we think about, 50 or so, 70 years onwards, where we are at right now, we still have so much more to kind of persuade and argue with to move beyond that status framework. Because essentially this idea and the racialized hierarchy of nation states story is also important, because the self-determination idea at the start of the 20th century, the plebiscite idea at the start of 20th century, all of these, this whole Wilsonian doctrine, all of this is meant for European peoples. They want that to happen in Europe. And when, 30 years later, that starts to happen in the rest of the world, they're like, okay, well, that's not what we bargained for. So now, for us, 70 years on, it is really important to think of what decolonization, and in fact, the title of a paper that I'm working on, what does 21st century decolonization look like? Have we finished with decolonization once and for all? If not, then what are the ways in which we can create the discourse for this, create the norms for this in the 21st century, so that the oppressed peoples who continue to have, not have their political rights or have a choice between economic and political rights, we are able to address that. And we have to do all of this while knowing the selectivity and hypocrisy of human rights, the way in which that's pursued, and the organized hypocrisy of sovereignty.
Thank you. Sangache, I want to ask one. Yeah, fine. Yeah. Good focus. Sangache, yeah. There you go.
Thank you. So I don't, all right. How do I understand these questions? So I think one of the things we're talking about is political communities, and like how do we get solidarities to function in ways that are strategically useful and that bring about real change, and what vocabulary can we find to move towards a solution once we have diagnosed the problem. It's unfortunately, I don't think I have good answers, but there are certain thoughts that I want to offer. So the first very preface thing that I want to say is, when I heard you speaking, it was, it's like my heart belongs at two ends of the Himalayas, Kashmir and Bhutan. So I every time I hear somebody speak Kashmiri, Kashmir outside, or if I hear something that sounds like Tibetan Zonka, it just takes me back. So it was very, very nice to have him, have you speak. But equally, I think that every time that I think about it, your question really is, will change of strategy make a difference to the other? I'm inclined to be very pessimistic about that. One, because states have, especially small states, have constraints that are significant in terms of, it's very easy for even like material infrastructures to be denied to smaller states. So I think it's very hard for states, regardless of what they actually might want to do in the value domain. And also, I mean, this is as old as history. I mean, even the Greek city-states did not unite against the Persians. So it's always possible for smaller states not to view their cause in common for a variety of reasons. And that's been true of the history of 100 years and history of 1,000 years. So you cannot count on the fact that solidarities will automatically follow from shared identities, because interests and identities are not very neatly aligned, right? They can be different. Now, however, the real, I mean, I think that even with scholars with whom you share a lot of overlap, you might have different perspectives, and I think that's the case here with us. I think that these, and I think that the solidarities actually with the Chinese people are important. And the reason I think that is because if I think about, say, something like Kashmir, which I've written about and worked on for a long time, and I'm also Kashmiri myself, I'm actually Kashmiri. So I've seen how this political dispute has become communalized, it's kind of destroyed the lives in different ways of Kashmiris. And instead of getting better over time, in 2019, you even had like whatever autonomy there was also went away, also was taken away. So, and that is done by a country that's a democracy. That's not even communist authoritarian, at least ranking wise or name wise, regime wise. So given that that kind of thing can happen so easily and can just pass by, I feel like the real solidarities to develop are with understanding that states function a certain way, but states is not equal to people. That it's always possible to find, or should be possible to find, stories, narratives, ways of connecting with people that may be different from state's position. It's like what Putin is doing in Ukraine is wrong. That doesn't mean that you think that all Russians are evil, all Russian individuals are evil. Likewise, if a government has a stance, if the government revokes the autonomy, doesn't mean that there aren't people in India who don't understand or who won't be able to understand that, the denial of freedom and political rights is wrong. And I think it should be the same with any part of the world. There's always indoctrination, and there can be more indoctrination in authoritarian systems and higher cost. But I feel like that is the thing. It's not just speaking to people in far away. I think location is not a geographical thing. Both people far away and people there, people overseas, people inside. It doesn't matter who the people are. I think the important thing is to create that solidarity, because actions follow from thoughts, and that thought part is what we have to get people to see. It's possible today for a lot of people to see that empire was wrong, but a lot of people who were part of empire didn't initially see it, and then some did, and then more of them did, and it was possible. So for me, pessimistic as the situation is, the hope lies in the ability of creating solidarities against identities, not necessarily only with people who agree with us. And so that's the thing. Now, in terms of strategically what that would be like, I think obviously, in the present day world, we feel there's, on the one hand, I think the internationalism that we need to build these solidarities. And on the other hand, two very important kind of counterbalance to this. One, technology, which can be used very easily to repress communications anywhere. And secondly, finance. The financial linkages that cross national boundaries, the commodity value chains that silence political talk and that create justifications. So it's a battle between the fact that we have to do this and that there are these forces that are arrayed against what needs to be done. It's not an easy battle to win. I don't think it happens. I think that we can spend a lifetime and change may not happen. But on the other hand, it's worth never losing hope, because if we don't try, nothing will happen. And you never know, even something as formidable as the Berlin Wall, when it fell, people didn't know a month before that it was going to fall. So you never know how certain big changes happen, but the critical consciousness is what has to be continually worked at. So that for me would be like a little bit of like the place where I would see hope. Yes, it's true that colonialism for most of history has that development now works often as colonialism, as civilizing mission, as a thing that brings people, that in the name of liberation brings people all sorts of restrictions and was once used by the West, continues to be used also now by the non-West. So it's as if the club has widened, but the fundamental rules haven't changed around what power is and how it's exercised. So even when it's not formal, the idea, you see, the appeal of an imperial ethos is, I am more rational than you and I'm morally superior than you. Whether it's the colonization is formal or not, that's the basis of it. That I don't need your consent. I know what's good for you. It comes from that thing, it's like you're a child, you don't know. It's that paternal thing. And that is what a lot of populations continue to face. Building of solidarities is important. The injustice frames that can travel better across different kinds of people who might not know and who might prefer actually very simplistic stories. I think it's the challenge is to tell a complex story while also make sure that there's a moral message that needs to be kept at the heart of it. But state is not equal to people is one way I think that's important. The decolonization, of course, that's a decolonization. In the talk I gave last year to some students at Harvard, I said, the decolonization, the desiderata for decolonization in our times is decolonization of mind, speech, and body. To go back to that, to this way of thinking, there's so many ways in which this needs to happen. To the question of the colonization by the non-West, I would just draw attention to something I would call India is to Kashmir as China is to Xinjiang, where I can't go into detail here, but where I talk about the moral wound of colonialism. Like how, for me, one really interesting and important fact about the modern world is that there is such a strong discourse of shame in having been colonized, right? If you are colonized, if you have been occupied, you are humiliated, you are weak, you couldn't resist it, but there is no equivalent moral discourse for having colonized, for having oppressed other people. That's taken as just the norm, what states do. So for me, what I'm trying to do to argue in that moral wound of colonialism through that concept is to say what we need is to create that discourse so that people feel shame, not in being colonized, but in being colonizers. And that is something I think that means changing the way in which we understand histories, both of the West and the non-West. To have that vocabulary of shame and humiliation, that could then perhaps be a way into creating those solidarities that we desperately need in the world today. And where's the weak point in all of this? So I would say, what is the thing on which my argument stands on? It stands on the fact that I'm trying to think that there is a link between affect and strategy. That strategy is not carried out by people who are completely immune to affect. I'm saying that there is a link. Maybe there's a transmission mechanism, and I'm trying to see, can we somehow fix and hack into that transmission mechanism so that strategy and the workings of power can be transformed through affect, through the creation of these solidarities, these norms. If that's not the case, and if it's somehow the case that strategy and power functions completely disconnected away from affect, then of course what I'm saying may not work at all even. But that's what I have to offer.
Thank you. We are running a little bit low on time. If anyone has questions, can you show me?
I'll answer the question. Can I go now?
2, 3. Okay. Pamela, go ahead.
Okay, my question is actually related to the earlier question about decolonial scholarship, the importance of it. And you talked about how Tibet is kind of trapped in the language of cultural and religious rights, and the difficulty of framing Tibet as a colonial question and at conferences, right? Do you think it has to do with the fact that overwhelming majority of Tibet scholars are religious people? We have very few political scientists or sociologists or historians. So you also talked about the difficulty of access, but it seems to me that there is actually a lot of access, even online, databases that no one has worked on the kind of scholarship that Dr. Kaul is doing. No one seems to be doing this kind of work. And why do you think that's the case?
So Dr. what?
Yeah. Thank you.
For instance, I'm looking at, for example, a source that no one seems to have looked at, the gazetteers, right? The gazetteers are examples of the materials that people like Bernard Cohn were working on, doing the kind of scholarship that we should be doing.
My question is, in order to sustain Tibetan freedom struggle, how important is to keep Tibetans inside Tibet and engage with Chinese in terms of business, trade, commerce, especially building on legitimate corporations? And what do you think are next changes in terms of that?
And my question, okay. All right, that's it, right? Okay, this is the last round. And then after you answer, you can pick either
And lastly, thank you for those questions. So I think that you're right. The institutions, knowledge is produced through institutions and it's replicated through certain pathways. And that is why, as Dibyesh also just hinted, that, the certain fields of scholarship get at times more attention. And in the case of people who work on different aspects of the Himalayan region, that's, the safe bets are anthropology, religion, now more and more ecology, or environment kind of thing as well, because it is I think it's that kind of knowledge doesn't a priori ask difficult questions. However, I think even that kind of knowledge can be made to us speak truth to power, and it just depends on the way in which one does it. And I think another thing is that those trajectories are changing overall as more and more people are aware of it. And I think there's also this understanding, not always based in fact, that academia and activism function as relatively separate and separable spaces. And I think now institutions are trying to understand the ways in which academics and the public sphere are actually connected. There's even, so just the creation of a category makes a difference. So for instance, in the UK now, there is a category called impact, through which an academic can register that actually this is the way in which I engaged with communities, this is what I did. And it's just a little thing on a form, not a little thing, but it's something on a form. But what it creates, this is how the technocracy works in knowledge making, is that it creates a possibility for that kind of work to be validated. So it's also about creating processes and entities that can measure something, bring something into being. And that is also a struggle, which is not a very kind of, it's not a attractive thing to be pushing for, but I think that kind of push also has a purpose. It's like a thing on a form makes a difference. One of the ways in which racist system wanted to perpetuate violence is at various times they just removed the category which said lynching as a cause of death of Black people, right? In the US. Once you don't have it recorded, it's not there. So just the way in which things get recorded and measured and classified also makes a difference into what is possible. And in this case, I think that impact makes that possible, because otherwise, and it should be possible. I think it should be possible to do and to have activist stances that do not lack rigor, that that can be rigorous and that can feed into and work with academic work. So it's so that these are not disconnected things that are working along parallel spheres, and scholars feel that they might get dirty or contaminated if they work with advocacy. Because the point is not that you advocate something without basis in fact. The point is that as good rigorous scholars, once you are advocating something, you should be able to say why, and you should be open to getting that, debating that in the public sphere and saying this is why it's important. So I think that that's important part of the story. The empirical question, again, the empirical question is for me really important. I feel like it's really important to know. So does it matter if we change the stance? Okay, well, what does political science tell us? It tells us something about nonviolent civil resistance movements. We should know more about that, relate that to specific cases we talk about. There is such a thing as the radical flank effect, that more extreme actors maybe shift the space to greater dialogue with moderate spaces, but that we don't know whether that actually works or not. That's an empirical question. Has it worked? That's an empirical question. That's an academic piece of work somebody maybe has done or needs to do to find out when shifts have been made, what effect has that been? How does that relate to what political science tells us about how radical flank effect works, how maybe maximalist demands of a movement work? So these are, I think, deeply kind of, also in a very rigorously important way, empirical questions that we need to look at. Does it work? When has it worked? Under what conditions has it worked? What can we do to make it work? While not being only limited by the method and the kind of empirical doesn't just mean numbers. It does mean maybe numbers, but empirical means just being able to access how things actually work in the world. And that includes registering how affect, sentiment, stories, narratives work. So I'm really saying that this is a multidimensional endeavor. It's hard, but it's important. And we don't have to sacrifice, we shouldn't sacrifice rigor for it. Just speaking out of moral worth, I'm not, I think that just speaking out of the fact that something is good doesn't mean people will be convinced, because human beings are very good at cognitive dissonance. They kind of find all ways of saying that it's good, but that's why I'm not doing it. So that's our hard job. And I think that's why these spaces are important. And I think that, yep, that is all I have to say. Thank you.
From Janawa.
It's a few minutes.
No. I just,
We need
I
other
stand
chair.
up and I don't want to take too long with this. So please sit down. No, you guys.
No, but we should get another.
No. I think I'll stand up. Yeah, I think I'll do that. So I don't know what to say. There's been a lot said today, but just first of all, and I really want to thank you guys for coming here. It's so important because the first lecture we've had here from the two of you, I think you really addressed the foundational kind of reason why we set this up, the High Asia. Especially, I think, starting with your talk, you are dealing with problems that the Tibetan community faces right now. There's a huge confusion in our kind of small world, and some of the facts that you brought up without being heavy-handed about it. Even like our kind of at the moment, the Tibetan kind of stress on human rights is not because we really care so much about human rights, but because that's the last alternative that doesn't really offend people. People don't want to get more political. And I'm not knocking human rights at all in any way, but I'm telling Tibetans, it's not only the question of one Lama who's being persecuted or beaten by the Chinese. That is important. But there's a whole nation that's going through genocide. Surely there is a kind of, we have to take the bigger problem sometimes and deal with it in the most serious way. So the issue that you brought on, I think in a very academic way, you are addressing the problems that the Tibetans have to resolve on this, by themselves. And to some extent, this is the reason for this institution here, and why it is also, although it is in some ways kind of modest, sort of, let's say, research library, it is located underground. Because we want to do things, and all great conspiracies and revolutions happen in the underground. So
All the uranium is hidden in
yeah. So this is our kind of, we are not just thinking in terms of, even for, the kind of person that I want to have come here are not necessarily academics or intellectually inclined, or people who read the New Yorker, whatever, it's also Tibetans who are not that well educated, but who want to do something for their country, and who want to, in some ways, listen to people who may have some kind of another way of looking at the problems that we face. And also to get the younger generation of Tibetans here, and also the older ones. But it's going to take a little while, but I think that is the most important thing here. For me, I feel that we could make a difference in the, let's say, the Tibetan struggle by, first of all, by getting the Tibetans together. At the moment, we are divided along a whole lot of different lines, and I don't need to talk about that, but you all know about that. But the most important thing is if we can come together, and even if you have different ideas and different sort of ideologies about what we should be doing, if we just come together, I think that alone will change things inside Tibet. Because one of the things that there may be great repression inside Tibet, but people are always looking out to exile, and they're getting fairly disappointed. But once in a while, when we do something here, it has great effect inside Tibet. And that's one thing I've always believed about Tibetans, especially the ones inside Tibet, is there's a huge kind of dormant dynamism. People are ready to come out and give up their lives. As we've seen, 168 self-immolations is a world record. And it's not something that we feel wonderful when it happens. Of course, we feel terribly sad, but it gives us reassurance that the people still have strength, that they'll fight on. So this is the reason why, in some ways, we have created this little space where even the work that we do, the activism that we may be participating in the future, this summer, is better informed. That we have the facts and the information, so that even if we have to argue our case, wherever it is, in whatever arena, it will be effective. And that's, I think, the bottom line for the kind of things that we do here. And another thing that I want to say how auspicious it was. Nitasha's talk, especially on Bhutan. And it's important because one of the reasons why we call this High Asia is because we're not just dealing with Tibet. We're dealing with the people of High Asia. For me, it's a particularly, what you might say, a special place. Not only the plateau, the Himalayas, but extending beyond it. And that's why I don't call myself an Asian. I'm a High Asian. You guys are South Asian. The Chinese are East Asian. And I like to keep it that way because sometimes the definition Asian just gets hogged by the Chinese.
But he is.
Maybe
Because I'm from Kashmir, so I'm
Oh, you are. So they do hog it. I mean, it's like, I don't think they do it intentionally, but because of their population, everything, if you're Asian, basically they feel you're Chinese. So I've made this particular distinction. And also in the terms of for Tibet, also it's so important, even if we do not get their support, political support at the moment, it doesn't change the fact that these people are related to us by ethnicity, by language, religious belief. There may be some variations here and there, but even people like in Baltistan who are reaching, they don't look like us at all. They're not really Tibetans in the ethnic sense, but because of history, because of language, they do reach out to us. We have conversations now and then. And it's so important that we deal with this greater, I don't mean it in the sense of the imperial greater, but in terms of friendship, and memories for Tibetans, it's so important that we include all these communities and also discuss their problems in ways like, it was very informative, the way that you went about your discussion in Bhutan. And I think, I've never really thought about Bhutan in that sense. I just thought of Bhutan more politically, the problems with Tibet. But when you see it from their point of view, and I think even the Tibetan community, they see it this way, especially because now we are living so close together here. It's not only Bhutan, it's from Mustang, there's Ladakhis, people from Yolmo, and Sherpas, all the chief Bajau here. So it's really important that, and I've tried to contact them and say, come here, whatever it is, if you want us to deal with something, we can do it together. So I think this is really auspicious that you should be speaking on this particular subject, and you did it so well. And I'd just like to, you want to wrap it up. Anyway, I just want to say how wonderful it was that you guys came here and rest my kathak here. So I just want to thank you. Yes. And I have some questions, but of course, some other time maybe. What time is it, Tendor?
It's very late.
Restaurants are almost 8:55.
You want to go for dinner?
Yeah.
Do you think we can?
Oh, it's up to you.
High Asia is inviting you.
Yeah, some places
High
really
Asia.
open, so we can go
Yeah,
and have something.
and I have two small questions. And Tendor, do you need one? Oh, yeah, he wants a picture with all of us. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, quick, guys. Please come in.
Oh.